Greetings everyone, and welcome to the 5th video of the video series on coping with adversity and recovering from crisis, where we will take a look at the concept of crisis and some of the most important things we need to consider when finding ourselves in this state, in order to recover effectively and without unwanted consequences. We will start off with, you guessed it, the definition, then continue to dig into the background a little bit, looking into the different types of crisis where you will have the chance to identify whether you have experienced any of them or if you find yourself in any of them at this time. Straight after, we will take a look at the 4 phases of crisis which were defined by Gerald Kaplan in 1964 to have that overview on this feature of experiencing crisis. Then we will take a look at the first and most important action step that we should take when in crisis, and continue by checking out other crisis recovery methods and do an exercise for one of them along the way. Finally, we will end this video by mentioning 3 essential things you should be aware of in relation to crisis and recovering from it. Here we are again with another definition to check out. As you can see, crisis is when we feel like we do not have the necessary resources of dealing with something that's important for us to deal with, and above all, we don't know how to deal with the fact that we can't do anything about it. Therefore, this sense of helplessness is accompanied by elevated levels of stress. As you can see here, many of the symptoms of crisis coincide with the symptoms of stress we mentioned in our first video: depression, irritability, insomnia, fear, fatigue, anxiety. However, some of them are slightly more alarming. For example, suicidal thoughts might appear, or apathy, which is in a sense worse than all the other unpleasant emotions, as it represents the absence of emotions altogether. That is often followed by dropping out of your usual activities, even those that are good for you, which is something you do not want to do in a time of crisis. Helplessness can also lead to substance abuse and excessive worrying about irrelevant or even imaginary issues, which can produce several mood swings during the day and impact ourselves and those around us badly. And finally, isolation is also a typical behavior of individuals in crisis, which is something to be avoided at all costs, as we will see further in this video. Let's move on now to the second section of this video and take a look at various types of crisis we can find ourselves in. The first is developmental. This represents the transition during changes of growth and development that occur as normal life events. Let's think of a couple of examples: graduation, marriage, pregnancy, and retirement. Now, these events are not necessarily stressful, and not everyone goes through a crisis when experiencing them. However, many people perceive these events as something they are not ready to handle and therefore need support in going through them. The good thing about developmental crises is that they are universal and predictable. Therefore, many prevention programs and activities are available for people who are about to experience developmental change in their lives. If you're interested to know more about this topic, you can check out Erik Erikson's theory on psychosocial development, where he describes several predictable developmental changes in our lives you might want to look into. You can find the link in the description of this video. Let's move on to the situational crisis. This one is unexpected, overwhelming, and can threaten our physical, psychological, and social safety and well-being. It can happen from an internal or external source. Examples of situational crisis are bankruptcy, car accident, divorce, disease, unexpected death of a loved one, job loss, academic failure, etc. The third type is social crisis. This usually refers to natural disasters such as earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, hurricanes, fires, as well as man-made disasters such as terrorist attacks, assaults, violent acts, riots, and global wars. I don't know whether you see the COVID-19 pandemic as a natural or man-made disaster, but either way, you have to agree with me that it is a social crisis, which will affect people globally and unfortunately most probably cause other misfortunes, leading to other types of crisis along the way. One of which could be existential crisis. We actually mentioned this one in our third video on managing adversity, so I won't be getting too much into it here. Just a reminder, existential crisis refers to a period in life when you question your life's purpose and search for meaning. The last one on the list is mental health crisis. Noticeable changes have occurred regarding mental health awareness over the last couple of years, and it is now more socially acceptable to admit to not being in a good place mentally and talk to professionals about it without being stigmatized from the society of doing so. As much as we can be grateful for people opening up more and having courage to maybe talk about lacking courage or having detrimental thoughts, there are still many things to be achieved in individuals seeking help from mental health professionals. To conclude with this section of the video, mental health crisis refers to the times when individuals cannot deal even with objectively low stress events, and when thoughts, emotions, and behaviors of that individual leans towards inducing harm either to themselves or others. Hence the necessity of reaching out to a professional when trying to recover from a mental health crisis. And now let's go through the 4 phases of crisis. The first one is the phase in which we notice a threat or face an event that triggers our stress response. In this phase, you try to cope with the trigger or event based on your past experience and the coping skills you used to face similar challenges or issues. The second phase is when your level of anxiety increases significantly, as using your knowledge from previous experience can't seem to solve this issue, and the coping skills that used to work in the past turn out ineffective this time. The third phase is where you decide to expand your resources. Look for other solutions and reach out to experts who can help you to deal with the experience you're going through. For example, psychologists, psychotherapists, crisis teams, etc. This is the step that can prevent the last step, which is the breaking point. This is where you will need to reach out to someone, as panic, despair, and irrational thinking and behavior are involved in this last phase. Which leads us to the first action plan you should take in any crisis you find yourself in. The first step is always to reach out. When we talk about a crisis, you need to be aware that this is not just something that you're not supposed to go through alone, but something that you cannot go through alone. Especially if the crisis is severe and it involves violent or suicidal thoughts. There are many people who are specialized in helping those that find themselves in these kind of situations. But even if you reach out to someone else, maybe someone close to you and someone you can trust, it still counts. We often feel as if others will judge us for our, let's call them, coping failures, and we think that no one can understand what we're going through. And we think that we are weird or that there is something wrong with us for experiencing a crisis and all the thoughts and emotions that come along with it. And that is what we call cognitive distortions in psychology. False thinking patterns that fog up the lens through which we see the world and prevent us from going over the barriers we encounter in life. Once we become aware of them, it's like we wipe that fog off and finally see the picture clearly again as we recover from our crisis. However, in order to clean the lens thoroughly, we need a high-quality cloth. That's what experts who help people recover from crisis represent. So the first step is to seek help. If you are not in an extremely critical crisis and you don't want to contact professional support for some reason, at least talk to someone you trust or someone you would feel comfortable talking with. The next important step is to keep things going. Remember how we mentioned apathy and inactivity in the beginning. Doing at least some things throughout the day will help us recover. Needless to say that when in crisis, it will probably be extremely difficult to go on with all of our regular activities. But you ought to keep some of them. Those should be the ones that do not require too much effort, but are important to you personally, and will therefore bring a sense of accomplishment and get that positive chemistry going on in your brain. We will do an exercise together on this one next. Another thing you can do in a crisis is reach to online materials, support groups, self-help books. However, you should check that all of these are indeed supportive and have a high chance for giving you what you need at that moment to help you in your crisis recovery. You should always pay attention to what you pay attention to and devote your time to and listen to and watch, especially in sensitive periods such as a crisis. Last but not least, taking care of your well-being is a must. We will get more into that in our next and last video of this video series. And now let's get to the exercise I promised. I would like you to take a piece of paper, or preferably the downloadable worksheet provided for this video, and write the things you have to or plan to do tomorrow. Simply list all the things you ought and you want to do. Write only those things that are not an integrated part of your everyday routine. For example, I don't want you to write things like wake up, wash my teeth, eat, go to bed, etc. But make sure to include all those things that are not present every single day by default. For example, you might write exercise. Now, in case you exercise every day and you do it automatically without having to include any conscious effort to it, then you can skip that. Here's an example. This shouldn't take that much time, so let's try and do this in 1 minute. Okay, time's up. The next step will be to prioritize them from 1, which is the most important task, to whatever number matches your list. And after that, I would like to ask you to underline the things that are urgent. For example, the things that you absolutely have to complete tomorrow, otherwise you'll miss a deadline or something of the sort. Here's an example once again. You have 2 minutes starting now. And time's up again. And now the final part. I want you to arrange the things you wrote based on the effort you have to put into them. If you have a colored marker, it doesn't have to be necessarily red, just write the letter E as an effort next to each task you wrote and adjust the size of it. For example, if a task requires a lot of your effort, put a big E next to it. If it requires medium effort, put a medium-sized E next to it. And if it requires minimal effort, put a small E next to it. You have 30 seconds to do this, and then I will give you instructions on how to finalize this exercise after you finish watching this video. Okay, I hope you managed to complete the third part of the task. If not, feel free to press pause and finish it up. And now let's take a look together at this list. The first thing that you want to do is check your underlined tasks. Those are urgent and you want to complete them early in the day if possible. Now you want to arrange the underlined based on your effort. Since we are talking about planning your day and keeping you active during a crisis, start with something that does not require that much effort, so that you can have a sense of accomplishment before you do the main task of the day, without wasting too much of your energy. Therefore, put an underlined task with a small e, if applicable, to the very first thing you would do tomorrow, and continue with the same principle through the rest of your underlined tasks. Then take a look at the tasks which are not underlined and include them in your list based on importance. So the ones with a lower number come before those with a higher number. This is to make sure you get to do the things that are important to you before the day ends. Now, of course, you have to be flexible with this, as there are tasks that have a fixed schedule. For example, if you're working in a 9-to-5 job or have an online meeting at a specific time. Here's how I adapted the to-do list example you see on the screen. I put the grocery store first. It is underlined and requires less effort than project work. As for Jerry, the Skype session is scheduled at 5 p.m., so this is not something I could have done first thing in the morning. So I decided to go to the store and accomplish my first thing of the day. Then I would give it a go with the project work. The tasks that require a lot of effort might be difficult to engage in during a crisis, so dividing these things in smaller parts, taking breaks, and doing short physical exercises in case you have a sedentary job could help you to go through with them. I plan to devote 3 to 4 hours to that, which means that I would still have time to do something else before Skyping with Jerry. I take a look at the list and decide to put exercise there, as it is the third most important thing for me to accomplish tomorrow. And I leave the reading for late afternoon, as it does not require much effort and will be the most relaxing activity to end the day with. So try to follow the steps to arrange your daily plan during a crisis. You can find them in the downloadable worksheet and in the end of this video. But be flexible, and most of all, don't worry if you don't manage to go through the whole list. When in crisis, the most important thing is to keep yourself going, to do something, even if it's just a couple of things a day. Even if it's just a third of your list, even if it's doing things that would be irrelevant at other times, such as this, marking your accomplished tasks. There's a whole field of psychology behind why this is helpful, but that is beyond the scope of this video, so you'll have to trust me on this. And now the 3 things that you should know with regard to recovering from crisis. You should be aware that crisis is something that is not necessarily negative. In many cases it is, of course, but once again, as when we talked about adversity, at times you can reap some important benefits after recovering from crisis. The second thing that you need to know is that crisis is a time-limited state that lasts approximately from 4 to 6 weeks. Therefore, despite the fact that it is an unpleasant and intense period, stress-wise, time-wise it is better than, for example, chronic stress that can last years to an end, or adversity that can also last for longer periods of time. Lastly, when you find yourself in a crisis, know that you can take this as an opportunity to take a time out and do something for yourself. We will go through many different things on this topic in our next video on well-being and well-being activities. And as always, a quick recap. We started today's video by defining crisis and realized that it is a time when we perceive that we don't have the necessary resources to deal with the demands we are facing. We took a look at 5 different types of crisis: developmental, situational, social, existential, and mental health crisis, and shared examples for each of them. Then we went through the 4 phases of crisis: the triggering event, anxiety buildup as things are not working out, followed by reaching out to new resources, which can also involve seeking professional help, and finally the stage of a mental breakdown, in case we don't manage to work things out in the 3rd phase. We emphasize the need to reach out and talk in times of crisis as the essential way of recovery. And then we got into an exercise that can be a useful additional tool when recovering from crisis, as it keeps us going, gives us a sense of accomplishment, and adapts our daily priorities to support our crisis recovery. Finally, we went through 3 things that we should be aware of when talking about crisis: the opportunity it might give us, the benefit of the expiration date, and the chance for finally devoting some time to our well-being, which awaits us in our final video. Thank you, and see you in the next and last video of this video series.